you don't want to loosen your grip because.
Yeah, don't let that thing go.
Welcome back, all you two kids.
Careful.
Yeah.
You gotta straighten it out.
Oh. You're doing so good. Isn't that what I did in Illinois though? Didn't I like knock
Yes.
the...
Yeah, but we weren't going to bring that up
I didn't notice.
because you always
But
make it. You always make an impact wherever you go.
Yeah, right? A
I didn't
literal
notice.
crashing impact. Thank you.
Welcome, and thanks to Sean and Wayne for arranging the photo on the ship, and Sue for coordinating us. When we get the pictures and we see if they're able to be transported across international boundaries, that they won't get us into trouble, we will share them with you. But I saw some folks hamming it up in the photo booth, so I'm dying to see what those photos look like. This afternoon, we're going to take a look into the research and data collection activities of NAFTE. And when I was hired as your executive director some years ago, the strategic plan at the time had as a goal to increase NAFTE's presence in research and grants. And I've been fortunate to be able to work with the Fire Protection Research Foundation, which is the research affiliate of NFPA, as a grant management team, if you will. But they were very receptive to when I would bring them suggestions for possible AFG grants. What you'll be hearing today came from discussion amongst NAFTE members, along with the report Casey and I will be presenting later this afternoon on our next immersive learning activity. Brittany Hollerbach, and I'll allow her to introduce herself, was the lead researcher on this project, where we were looking at the impact of training on the volunteer fire service. And Brittany, as I mentioned, was our lead researcher. She was joined by Joe Maruca, representing the National Volunteer Fire Council, and myself, representing NAFTE. And Sharini, whose last name I will not attempt to say because it's Indian. Ranganathan. Thank you, Casey. But we call him Sharini for short. Sharini was our program manager from the Fire Protection Research Foundation, and it's been a great relationship. This particular grant activity was to answer the question that many directors said they were hearing anecdotally. Volunteers were saying, you, being a state academy, are making it difficult for us, the volunteer fire service, to recruit and retain firefighters because of the state academy, training requirements. And it's too long, it's too intense, it's too many things. At the same time, we wanted to focus on that segment of the volunteer fire service that there was an overwhelming lack of data on. And that is communities protecting population of 2,500 residents or less. Now, if you think about that demographic, a community of 2,500 people protected by a volunteer fire department, just imagine, if you will, what is their funding depth? They could be doing fundraising at a local level. They might be getting a small stipend from the municipal government. If there is a municipal government, they could be in an unincorporated area. They might have access to training resources. They might utilize the state academy. Maybe they went to the National Fire Academy. But our sense was we didn't know. And our sense was they didn't know about the training directors to the extent we would like them to. And the purpose of the project was to try and collect data to put some facts and figures to that statement that training is impacting volunteer firefighters protecting communities of 2,500 or less. What we did not know is what would the data say that impact was. Is it a good impact? Is it a bad impact? Or is it neutral? Or is there any impact? So Brittany will explain the steps in the process. The one thing I'll take a little bit of your thunder away, is our survey that Brittany created, generated more than, how many thousand?
More than 1,000.
1,200?
More than 1,200, yeah.
More than 1,200 responses answered the questions to Brittany's survey. That is the greatest response from this population on this topic that we could find since I don't know, since Bruno invented Mrs. Smith. It's pretty important because of the amount of response we had, and the results really are credible. And it's going to help us answer that anecdotal question we heard about the impact of training. So with that, I'd like to welcome Brittany to take over the presentation. I'm going to allow her to present because she knows the facts and the figures. She created the survey, she's done the analysis, she's worked with us to reframe the data to better answer some of the questions that we thought needed to be answered. So she can give you a lot more insight into what the data is telling you than I can. So please give your attention to Brittany.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Hollerback. You can hear me okay? We're good?
Yep.
All right, awesome. I am an associate scientist. I work with NDRI. It is a small private nonprofit research foundation. Our office is in Kansas City. I work for Dr. Sarah Janke, for anyone that knows her. So that's what I deal with on a regular basis. Yeah, enough said there. No, she's amazing, and I love working in my office. My background's in the fire service. I was a firefighter for 4 years and then went back to school. The initial goal was to get my master's in kinesiology or exercise science. I saw a need with recruits coming into the training academy that they were not physically prepared to do the job. So my idea was, okay, I'm going to go get my degree in exercise science, come back and teach at our regional fire academy. And then once I got to school, I learned that people were studying firefighters. And my mentor, my graduate mentor in college, happened to be working with some of the folks at NDRI, including Sarah. And she said, oh, like they had a study where they were studying high intensity functional training in the military. And so I thought, okay, this is cool. That's how I got involved in her lab. But then once I was involved with her research, she said, oh, you're a former firefighter. You might like this group, this NDRI. They're researching firefighters. And I'm like, oh my God, wait, people research the fire service? This is super cool. So I got into that, and then I just got hooked, and I stayed in school and finished my PhD in kinesiology as well. And then when I got out, I was fortunate enough to start working with Dr. Janke's group. And so I've been doing research ever since. And so this project, as Ken mentioned, is a FEMA-funded project that went through the NFPA Research Foundation. And we're partnering with the NAFTI group and NVFC on the project. The project had kind of 4 broad goals. The first thing I did was a literature review. From a researcher standpoint, when I am asked a research question, I want to go to the data and find out what already exists, what do we know. I'm sure the people in this room are not surprised to find that there's not a lot out there on the volunteer fire service. We've done a fairly good job at looking at the career fire service in the United States. We're still building on that research, and a lot of it in the last 10 to 15 years is funded by FEMA-funded research, which is why it's so important to advocate for federal funding, but as well as global and private funding as well, especially in the climate that we're in. It's just so important to continue to advocate for funding. So I'll say that to start with. But we started with a literature review, and I'll talk about some of the findings from that. The next step was to do some regional focus groups. So we did one at an NVFC summit. In fact, we did a couple at an NVFC summit back in Buffalo, New York, and then we did a couple at the NAFTI summit in Illinois, both of which were incredibly well attended. So I just want to point out how passionate folks are about this subject, recruitment, retention, and its relationship to training. People are excited to get in the room and to talk about it and to discuss what issues they found, but also what's working well. So I think part of when we started this research project, I think there is a connotation that it's all bad and the volunteer fire service is just collapsing and it's no longer going to exist, and like, what do we do? But I think that the volunteer fire service in some places is thriving. Like, there are departments that have full rosters and their training is great. And we had some conversations earlier, like a lot of that goes back to culture. So we'll talk about that, right? But I want to point out, like, it's not all bad and it's not like crashing and burning. So that's like the point of the studies. How can we figure out what people are doing well and kind of communicate that to the rest of the fire service? So step 3 was a national survey, and then we also did state level interviews, and I'll talk a lot about the national survey results today and kind of color that in with some of the qualitative stuff that we got back in conversations with folks during interviews. And then step 4 is what we're currently working on, which is finalizing the final report and what goes in. And we ended up with so much data, which is great, but also like, oh my gosh, how do I break it down into like a comprehensive report? So that's kind of where we are. Okay, so overall findings. This is the main question that we asked: does training impact recruitment or retention? How many of you in this room think yes, training impacts recruitment or retention? Okay, and how many of you think no, it does not impact recruitment or retention? Interesting. Okay, so one thing that I think going into this that I thought I would hear is what Ken mentioned, and that is, well, there's just too many training requirements, and you put too much on us, and or the NFPA puts too much on us, or our state puts too much on us, or that much training isn't required. And overwhelmingly, via the survey as well as interviews, we heard that training is required. Training is necessary. People want to do training. And in some of the departments that have the best rosters, like the fullest rosters, they're doing a lot of training, but they're doing good training. And that's the key. That's what we'll talk about. So, probably not shocking to you guys, training was perceived as a barrier by some, and usually there's like qualifiers. So in the survey we asked, do you think that training is a barrier to recruitment? And then separately we asked the question, do you think training is a barrier to retention? And then their answers were yes, no, and maybe / I don't know. So then I looked at the maybe I don't knows, like qualitative responses that people typed in, and we'll talk about all of this in a minute, but there were so many responses. So I think overwhelmingly, like, there's a lot of people that are like, well, it depends. And so as a researcher, I think very black and white. So when I see this, like, maybe I don't know, it depends, I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do with that? So on one hand, it's good. I often wear my t-shirt with the nerd bird that says more research is necessary. This is showing us more research is necessary. Part of that makes me happy, it's job security. Part of it makes me crazy because I want to just be able to answer the question, right, and move on to the next one. But it's all good, it's good. And so overwhelmingly, folks indicated that departments want flexible, modular, and hands-on training. We had a discussion at lunch today about how important hands-on training is. That is like, if you ask firefighters why they do the job, you often hear, we want to help people. We love that it's hands-on. It's something different every day. I'm not sitting behind a desk, it's active. Firefighters are big with hands-on, so we have to maintain hands-on training, but also figure out what we can do to supplement that if you can't always be in a drill tower, right? And then immersive learning. We'll chat about the role immersive learning may play in the fire service and why it's important. Okay, so I mentioned we did this literature review. It returned 14 peer-reviewed articles, 11 other relevant articles that weren't necessarily peer-reviewed. That includes like dissertations and theses work. And we noted some relevant NFPA standards as well, which I think are important to include in the report so people kind of see this full picture of all of the things that impacts recruitment and retention and training. These tables may be hard to see from where you are. I would be more than happy to share them with you along with all of the slides that I'm presenting today, but this is a list of the peer-reviewed articles that we found. We found stuff from as far back as 1998 and as recent as like 2016, 2020 even, there's an article, and these are specific to recruitment and retention impacting volunteers. So I'd be more than happy to share these with you. This is kind of like an FYI, this is what we found. These are additional documents, so there's some really great guides from the NVFC. There's also some theses, dissertation work, and then there's some things that were published in like the Ohio Task Force, so like the city put together a report, and those are also very impactful. And then a list of NFPA standards. This is probably not exhaustive, but it is pretty all-encompassing of things that impact recruitment, retention, training, and the volunteer fire service. So like I said, I think these are just important to include in our final report as they all impact our ability to recruit, train, and retain folks. Then I mentioned the focus group, so we'll talk a little bit about the qualitative research and then the surveys. So as Ken alluded to, we have over 2,000 responses, which is huge. I'm going to tell you. So I have a colleague, Maria Keppel. I don't know how many of you know Maria. Maria was a career firefighter. She's currently a volunteer and combination firefighter and also a researcher in our shop. And at one point we were talking about getting responses from, let's be clear, human subjects research is very difficult. Asking people to take surveys sucks. Like, Nobody wants to take surveys. Everyone's incredibly busy with their time. Like, how often do y'all get surveys from like the hotel you stayed at or the, right? And you're like, nope, nope, nope. Okay, so bless you. Fire service, same. Like they don't want to do it. So at one point, Maria said that the volunteer fire service is even worse than the career fire service. I think some of it is the career fire service, they tend to be in the station house. You can like go and physically talk to them. And if you could have an audience like this and I could say, oh, take out your phone and we'll kind of go through this together, that increases participation. Volunteers, you don't tend to have that same interaction unless you go on like a training night and then you get a higher response rate. But in general, it's hard to get survey responses. So Maria said, volunteer firefighters are like cockroaches. And I was like, oh my God, what? And she's like, no, like there's tons of them, right? There's more volunteer firefighters in the United States than there are career firefighters, and yet when you shine a light on them, they scatter. And I was like, huh, she's not wrong, and especially when it comes to surveys. So, as Ken mentioned, I am very, very excited to report that there were over 2,000 responses from volunteers across the United States, so that was awesome. And then in this study specifically, we were focused on more rural communities, smaller communities that protect less than 2,500 people. We had 567 responses, so that's about 30% of the sample, which was awesome. So what that does is that allows us a large enough sample size to draw some inferences from. We can say, okay, this may be generalizable to the population of volunteers in the United States as a whole. I mean, we still have to be careful about generalizations, but it gives us a good data sample to draw from. Oh, and there were folks from all across the U.S., the Northeast, South, Midwest, and West regions. We broke them down by NFPA region. Okay, so what does the population look like? Like I said, we're focusing on populations that protect less than 2,500 people. This is a look nationally at the population protected, and this is a look at our survey. So 32% of our survey protected folks in communities of less than 2,500 people compared to the national sample. That's the biggest group of volunteers. They protect the smallest communities. So you can see those populations are quite similar, our survey to the national sample. All right, and then looking at participant demographics, so we're looking at age brackets here. You can see most of our sample fell into the age ranges between 40 and 50. So about 24%, so a quarter of the sample fell between 40 and 49, and 53% fell in the over 50. And then years of service, most of them had over 10 years of service, which I think is quite common for the volunteer fire service. We'll talk about that later. And then the next largest group is very close, but it goes greater than 10 years. Then the 6 to 10 is a little bit bigger, that's 14%. Then the 1 to 5 folks, and then the people with less than a year, are just that tiny little yellow sliver there. So we talked a little bit about years of service. We did ask if the department had a cap on the number of members. Now, when you ask a survey, you think that you're brilliant and you've thought of all the questions, and you're like, okay, it's good to go. And then you get responses back, and then you start talking to people, and you're like, oh, well, I asked, did you have a cap or limit on the number of volunteers? Because in my brain, I'm asking, are you full? Like, is your roster full in a good way? And what I realized was they may have a cap not because they're fully flush with volunteers, but they can't afford to take on anybody else, or we can't train anybody else at this time, or a number of other reasons, right? So when I asked the question, the reasons why they answered this way may not be what I had in mind. So yes, for a cap was about 37% of folks. So I was like, oh, this is great, 37%, like they're full. That may not be the case. So in this survey, I can't drill down on that any further, but it is interesting to think through survey questions. So FYI, if you're thinking of sending out a survey about anything, talk with people about it, have them pick holes in it, and ask additional questions, because eventually you'll get the survey back and you'll be like, oh shoot, what was this, and I want to know more. We also asked about a waiting list of folks interested, and only about 7% of folks had a waiting list, whereas about 93% said no, they didn't have a waiting list. So I think that's kind of pretty common with what we would expect. We asked about recruitment. So these words at the bottom are very small, so I will highlight the largest bars are public events here in purple, open houses in blue, junior firefighter programs in green, community outreach in red, referrals in this maroon color, and then social media in pink. Those were like the the primary, and it echoed that when I interviewed firefighters as well and asked them about recruitment and retention and how were you getting folks on. When I did interviews, I swear the most common responses were word of mouth, and word of mouth kind of bled into family. My family's in it. My mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, my cousin, my friend. That's why they joined the fire service. So social media kind of came in there, and I think the whole technology thing is something that we have to talk about. Like, I think there's a lot of opportunity for social media, and I've talked with folks today where we were talking about how the fire service doesn't like the way things are, but also they don't like change, right? And so they don't want to hear that you have to be on social media in order to market. And I don't think the fire service ever had to market itself before, right? Like when I was a firefighter, when I was applying for jobs, I knew that I was up against like hundreds of people applying for 2 to 5 spots. Whereas now, there's like 20 people applying for 2 to 5 spots, and it may not be 20 great candidates either, right? So I think this is a change for the fire service in general, that we have to get comfortable with promoting the fire service when we never had to do that before. Oh, and we have to use social media, and we don't want to do that. So lots of changes are coming. But the point is, lots of volunteer recruitment, I think, happens via social media. And people mention that it may not necessarily be a recruitment post as much as it is sharing what your department does on social media. People talked about sharing a good call, like a call with a good outcome, or yes, we protected this property tonight, or we're going to be at this community event on X date, like come out and see the fire department, come and touch a truck, come by and we're doing this promotional, they're cooking a pancake breakfast, those types of things. So a lot of that social media interaction may not necessarily be a direct recruitment ask, but instead it's, hey, get involved, come and see what we do. So why are there less volunteers today than there were 5-10 years ago? So this is super interesting. This is on the survey, we listed the following reasons. Reasons for why there are fewer volunteers. Too much training required, don't have enough time, too dangerous, people don't want to do physical labor, or something else. And they're really actually quite evenly split, like about 30% for each category. So to me, that means like it could be any of these things. And so then this word cloud over here is a representation of what folks said qualitatively, if there was an other or from our interviews. And so some of the big words mean they were said more times in the interviews and in the qualitative responses. So time, lack of incentives, financial, training, competing priorities, and then you can see a little bit smaller is things like culture, the organization, generational awareness, right? So a lot of things that we have to work on the culture of the fire service. So okay, let's get to training, because the original question was, how does recruitment and retention relate to training? So we looked at how often are folks training, and does that impact their responses? So we found that folks are doing average annual participation about 6 fire attack drills per year and 1 live fire training per year. Again, folks continued to note that hands-on, realistic, and scenario-based training were the most valued. Like, I'm sure none of y'all are surprised. Like, every firefighter you talk to, I want to do hands-on training. I want to get on the drill ground. I want to do hands-on training. And departments varied widely in how that was structured, right? Especially with when you first bring in a recruit, is it that you send them to a fire academy? Is it that you do the academy in-house? And then, in the United States anyway, states vary on what's required. There are states that literally require 0 training. Come in, we'll get you gear, you can go inside a house fire. And then there are other states that require a certain number of hours of training or even state level certifications before you can go into an IDLH environment. So there's such a wide variety that's out there. And of course we have NFPA, which are national standards, but they're not required. And some departments, they just can't meet them. Departments are having a hard time outfitting their folks in gear, and people have creative solutions for that as well. So we'll talk about some of those things. Okay, so we asked who had accessed state training. We had about 24%, so a quarter of the sample had accessed in-person training at an academy, at their state academy. 11% had accessed online training sponsored by their state fire academy. In-person training at their station was more common, about 40%, and then not applicable, a little over a quarter of the sample. So this is telling me, and we had conversations with Ken and with Joe, so NVFC and the NAFD group, and I think a lot of it is the visualization, right? How do we get the word out? And Victor talked about that this morning with the mission of the NFFF, and the people in this room, like, we all know that these resources exist, but how do you get it out to the very most rural communities? And even my naive self, like, I'm doing all these interviews with volunteer firefighters from all across the United States, and I'm thinking like, oh, well, they, even if they have to drive hours to get to a fire academy, they could do online courses, and there's so much availability there, and there is, but also realize when you're in a community that protects less than 2,500 people, it's very rural, and your access to things like internet is different than me, who lives in a city, and I've always had access to internet, and those are things like I don't even think about, right? I think about, okay, like you may not be able to drive all the way to a fire academy, but certainly you can set up all this stuff in the training center, and you can, and then I talk to people and they don't have a fire department to operate out of, right? The rig is parked like on the side street, and they have this dirt lot, and that's where they respond, and like stuff like that blows my mind. So we have to think about like our smallest, worst resource department when we think about our volunteer fire service. Okay, other access to training. So we asked if the department engaged in any of these. One was the State Fire Academy, again about 25% of the sample. County level trainings, especially for small rural areas, a lot of them will get together and do like a county-wide training, so that was 30% of the sample indicated they had done that. Web and online, only 20%. A local college or university, only 8%. We asked them, had they ever been to the National Fire Academy? Less than 2%. Less than 2%. This is a free resource for people. And then our department does not engage with any of the above, was 10% of the sample. Like, yikes. So to me, again, I think very much in like the translation and dissemination of research. So I think of, okay, how can we get the word out? I'll tell you guys about Science to the Station towards the end here, but I think there's a really important component to this that says we need to do a better job at selling what NAFD is, what NVFC is, what resources are available, and how we can get into these small communities and better serve them. Okay, so we get to the prime question. Is training a barrier? So we asked, like I mentioned earlier, we asked two questions. Is training perceived as a barrier to recruitment, and is training perceived as a barrier to retention? And as you can see here, yes, no, and I don't know, maybe are rather evenly divided. You can see it's a little bit more clear for recruitment that it may be a barrier. 42% said yes, training is a barrier to recruitment. For retention, it's a little more evenly divided. The no's are actually the biggest group. No, it's not a barrier to retention. So let's kind of dig into this. Okay. So this is some of the qualitative responses. I mentioned that the question had yes, no, and maybe I don't know. So I took the maybe I don't knows and kind of tried to summarize them here. So one thing was a time commitment for firefighter 1 and 2. It was mentioned earlier that this can really range, and it's also changed over time. But often, quite commonly in fact, it is 100 to 160 hours that is required for fire 1 and 2. And so when folks come in the door, and first of all, people don't want to volunteer their time. And this is like, it's not just the fire service, this is a generational thing where people are very protective of their time. There's so much going on. And I think we're also overloaded by social media and just access to things all the time. So people are, for better or worse, I think a little bit better at saying no to things, which then hurts the volunteer organizations. I mean, less people are volunteering for their churches, for Boys and Girls Clubs, for the fire service, etc. So just volunteerism is lacking or is on a decline. But a lot of this can be these requirements, especially when you come in the door. And again, I think this speaks a lot to culture. In the interviews, we kind of tease this out. So I think it can have a lot to do with when a new firefighter comes in the door, whether you say, oh yeah, here's your requirements, go off and do these, and then come back when you have, checked off this list, or I need you to go to the state academy and get these hours done, and then once you've done that, then you can come back and then we'll talk. Like that, people tend to kind of fall off. They lose interest. When people seem to be really engaged is when the chief or the training officer or whoever talks to this potential member says, I'm really excited you're here. Like, here's a set of gear. Let's learn how to put this on. It's about diversity of roles and bringing that person on and allowing them to learn the truck, learn the equipment. They can get equipment on scene, right? So they can respond, but in a limited capacity. They're not going into the ideal age atmosphere. They're not putting on an air pack. They're not issued a face piece, but they're issued some gear, right? And maybe it's not gear that fits them perfectly, but they're learning how to wear it. They're learning the job. And in the meantime, they have a skills book. And so a lot of people talked about making training more modular. So let's learn about fire behavior as a module, and then we'll move on. And then let's learn about ladders as a module, right? And move on. And let's learn about gear. Rather than a required 2-week condensed program. Again, volunteers usually have a full-time job elsewhere, so it's very hard to ask them, hey, can you go to a Monday through Friday 9 to 5 Firefighter 1 course, especially if it's far away. But even if it were in the same town, they can't take off work to go to a 2-week fire academy. But also, people have mentioned that the other option is weekends, so for 2 months, you go every weekend to the fire academy for Fire 1 and 2. And it sounds more flexible, but who wants to give up every single weekend to do something either, right? So again, I think it's all about the fire service changing our perceptions of what folks want to do to make it more engaging and to make it more available for them to be able to do it. People also mentioned just travel to the academies, right? A lack of flexible training related costs. Even in focus groups, I've had people say, well, I think the cost of training is a deterrent. And someone said, no, even in my state, we have stipends to send folks, and they still don't use those training opportunities. So I think it's a combination of things, right? You have to make it available. You have to help them get there. Again, this research is blowing my mind because I very much want the black and white answers, and it's not that at all. So we mentioned that prospective members lose interest, right, when the training expectations seem too high. And this is what I mentioned, is this modular or essentials-only approach to lower entry barriers. What can we do? How can we get this person engaged right away with the most minimal training? And people talked about support staff roles, learning how to fill air bottles, switch air bottles out on scene, perhaps only teaching them to drive the rig so that they can drive the rig, and learning pump operations early on, right? And they can't go inside, but they can at least participate in activity. So lots of different ways to get creative to use those folks immediately, because I think that's the biggest thing. Once you start doing the job of a firefighter, you kind of get bit by that fire bug, but you have to get to that point, right? Going through the training manual is not going to get you hooked. Okay, so what about retention? Ongoing training competes with personal and professional obligations. Folks mentioned that, yeah, people will come in maybe before they have a family, but then they have a spouse or significant other and their time commitment kind of wanes, or they have a child and their time really wanes because they have to be at home. People mentioned childcare issues as well, right? So if you're in a 2-parent household, if one spouse has to be working and you're home with the child, how are you supposed to respond if the volunteers get a call? And I have talked to some volunteer departments that are doing amazing things. One was a child care system, right? So if the volunteers got paged out for a call, they would have a rotation of who would take child care duty. So one person would be responsible to go to the station, and they would stay there to watch whoever brought kids in. And then the rest of the folks could just bring their kids in and then go respond. So you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Someone just take care of the kids, and now I can respond to my community. So it's all these different ways to get involved in the fire service that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And firefighting tends to be a male-dominated occupation. A lot of the people that I talk to were like, oh yeah, it's a great way to get the wives involved because they can do watch the kids, and the men can go do the fire. And I was like, well, the women could also go fight fire, but I mean, whatever. The point is, I think that's great. I think if we're engaging everybody and getting them involved in what they may be interested in doing, whether that's childcare or administrative work or equipment maintenance, we can use everybody. The fire service needs everybody. Training burnout was common, and then I think one of the things that was mentioned the most was, I think we train, especially in the volunteer fire service, and there's multiple reasons why we train on the basics in the volunteer fire service. I think part of it is they may not see enough volume of fire, for example, to be comfortable with fire behavior or with gear operations or water flowing, and so you tend to work on those basic skills often. But what I heard from folks was that that gets a bit repetitive, and they really want to get to some advanced skills, especially members that have been there a while. They'd like some classes on leadership or officer training or command and control or radio communications, right, where they don't want to keep doing the basic trainings. But of course, that's hard for a volunteer organization. Like, how do I then split up the training? And then, like, I talked to one person who's like the fire chief and the training officer, and he's responsible for the new recruits, and like, you're wearing all these hats. So do you ask this person to do an additional training? Like, oh, okay, we train the newer members this night of the week, and we train the more senior members this night of the week. And like, it becomes burdensome to the training staff as well. So of course, like, there's all these things that we need to work through, but these are all the things that we need to work through. Like, when we ask ourselves, why isn't the current model working? Perhaps this is why. And then engaging training. So I think that the fire service as a whole, and especially the volunteer fire service, used to be much more of a social club, and people joined because they wanted to feel connected. I talked to a lot of people and asked them why they joined, and they were like, I want to be a part of my community. I joined to meet people. And yes, they joined to meet people, but they also joined to do a job. So I think it's so important to remember that people nowadays value their time more than ever before. So it's all about efficiency. So yes, they want the camaraderie, they want the brotherhood and sisterhood of the fire service, but if you schedule a training for 6 p.m., I'm going to show up at 5:30, and by 6, we better be rolling. Like, when I show up, tell me what equipment to get out, tell me what gear I need to be in, tell me what tools we need. I want to be ready to go. I don't want to show up and you're like, everyone's chatting and shooting the shit, and then it's like, oh, by like 6:30, we're like, okay, well, I guess we better do some training. What do you guys want to do tonight? Are you kidding? No, like, you need to have an idea. And so I think that's a lot of it is, again, it goes back to culture and leadership. And on the flip side, when I talk to leaders, like, that's very difficult, right? Because that puts a lot on their shoulders that they have to do all of this training. And if they're not large enough or well enough funded to have any kind of training staff or folks to help them, that falls on, like, perhaps the fire chief, who's also doing training and admin and all the other things. But, again, a consideration, right? So people want to show up, they want that efficiency, they want to be in and out in the whatever you have scheduled, 2 hours, and they want to learn something. Like, they'll laugh and joke while they're at it, but they seem very efficient. Like, they really want to make the most of the time that they're there. All right, so training is a barrier. These are people that answered yes. Training is a barrier to recruitment or retention. We have recruitment in yellow, retention in blue, and this is looking at the number of hours that they train plotted against the yeses. So you can see that when we asked the department annual training hours, folks fall anywhere from about 10 to 50 hours on average annually. And it's not hugely surprising that there's like a peak of yeses for yes, training is a barrier, and it goes down as you get too much training and goes down as you get too little training. So I think this is interesting. Again, the recruitments are a little bit higher, meaning that folks perceive that training perhaps is a barrier more so for recruitment than it is for retention. Like, once you get folks in, you can kind of keep them in. Training may not be the reason that folks are leaving the volunteer fire service, but it may be the reason that people are not entering the volunteer fire service. But it doesn't seem to matter how much you're training. Like, if you look, 30 to 40 hours annually looks similar to 40 to 50 hours annually. And even fewer folks said yes, it's a barrier if they train 50 to 75 hours annually. So it may not be training that's the sole issue here. Now, I want you to look at this one and look at that one. They look very similar, yes? So the question, is training a barrier? Yes? Is training a barrier? No. So the no's look very similar. Again, the no's for retention are a little bit higher, so this is the reverse. But they're saying the same thing. They think it impacts recruitment more than it impacts retention. But again, it doesn't matter how many hours you're training. The average hours are between 10 and 50 to 75, right? And there's like this bell curve where you see a little bit more responses there in the middle. But overall, okay, so I'm getting, it impacts recruitment a little bit more than it impacts retention. A little bit. So what do we do with this? What's next? So one thing, and I'm so excited that Ken and Casey will report on the train project and talk a little bit about immersive learning, and they'll instruct you that immersive learning can be anything that engages 2 or more senses. We had a wonderful conversation. We were talking with Joe Maruka, and he's like, I mean, I don't even understand what immersive learning is. I think you guys are saying hands-on. And we're like, kind of. So I think that's the benefit as we move forward, is instructing folks on what in the world is immersive learning. How can we use this technology? What does it mean for the volunteer fire service? And when I asked volunteers during the interviews, what do you think about immersive learning or the use of technology? Some people were really open to it, and I think the biggest barrier is a perception that type of technology is too expensive right now to be utilized in the volunteer fire service. So I think that's also huge, and I think it will take time. Right now, a lot of those products are very expensive, but as time goes on, they'll be less expensive and more accessible to the volunteer fire service. But how can we modularize training requirements and emphasize the importance of hands-on training, because you know that that's what the firefighters want. But one thing I learned from an interview was that hands-on training can be something as simple as we all sit down in this room and I put up a PowerPoint about a nasty fire that I ran 5 years ago, and we talked through incident control and command. Even that can be considered hands-on because we're engaging, right? We're using more than one sense. We're using more than 2 senses. We're looking, we're thinking, we're talking out loud, we're having dialogue. So all of those things, right? It takes me presenting a PowerPoint to us all engaging in scenario-based training. That's what kind of takes it to the next level. That's what gets folks engaged. That's what keeps them off their cell phone and engaged in the lesson. So just rethinking. I really think it's a whole thing about rethinking how we're doing training, rethinking how we're preparing for training. Like, we're prepared at the time that training's supposed to start. We know what equipment we want. We know what drills we want. We know what objectives we want to meet that day. So the importance of immersive learning. I mentioned numerous times the importance of hands-on, realistic, scenario-based training. And I have to remind myself, because I grew up in a suburban area, I had access to a training center, I had access to a Class A burn facility we could go to do Class A burns. My training facility was a propane burn facility, but we had access to these actual tangible things, dummies to drag and smoke-filled rooms and fires to put out. And so many volunteer fire departments, they don't even have a training center, let alone they may not have even a classroom facility to work out of. So you have to really think about your least resourced department or station in your city, county, jurisdiction when we're thinking about training. Not everybody has access even to do a scenario like this, like a classroom setting. So thinking about the flexibility and local access, engaging in the training and avoiding burnout, like I mentioned, and then opportunities for skill retention through those realistic simulations. So the current gaps really tend to be limited access to simulations, to live fire especially. A lot of people mentioned that the reason they couldn't do in-house fire academies was they couldn't fulfill the live fire burn requirement. And so they'd have to send folks to state training academies in order to do that. And in a lot of places, that's hours away from where they live. Again, frustration with repetitive or irrelevant methods, the need for modern, engaging, and morale-boosting approaches. I go back to culture, right? And a lot of folks that I talk to in interviews mention that, they don't want to show up if you can feel this, if you walk into a room and there's this palpable tension, or you don't feel welcomed there, you don't feel like you belong there, you're going to stop showing up. So it's not even just about the training side of it. It's about the camaraderie and encouraging folks to get together and, hey, let's have dinner together, let's do something together, let's get all the families together. Remembering that human piece as well, because that's really what pulls folks in. And then opportunities for skill retention through realistic simulations. So if you don't have a burn building, what else can you be doing to simulate these activities, to talk through them? Maybe it's a PowerPoint to talk through and show pictures of actual scenarios, run them through radio traffic, right? People love to hear the actual radio traffic from incidents. And then where does immersive learning come in? Immersive learning can be so many different things, and I know that Ken will talk about this later, but it could be things like VR, AR, realistic, it's safe environment, right? And it allows you to do so much with so little. Of course, there are limits to technology and things are expensive, but there are so many different things. I remember years ago, do y'all remember the Wii? This was generations of technology ago. Now kids have all the things that I don't know what it is. But okay, the Wii. I had a Wii growing up, and there was a firefighter game, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And you could like literally go through a building, and you did these different tasks, and you had your air pack on, and like. But so even, I mean, God, that was like 10, 20 years ago. And even then, there were things that, I mean, you know, it was limited, and like you were sitting going through something. It wasn't like you were active or had AR goggles on or anything like that. Like that didn't exist. But even that long ago, there was technology that you could use. And one of the best examples, I think it came from a focus group, was there was a fire chief in the room, and he said, you know what I did? There was a sale on TVs on like a Black Friday, and he got a bunch of TVs, and his wife was like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm taking these to the firehouse. And she's like, seriously? And he's like, hold on. So the chief brings these ginormous TVs into the firehouse, and people are like, what are you doing? You guys just sit around and watch TV all day? And he's like, no, hold on. These are used for training. What do kids love to do? They love to play video games all day. What am I going to do? I'm going to ask them to come in the firehouse. Hey, you can play video games all day. Because you know what? A, he's going to get them some like firefighter training engagement type video games. But his point was, I don't really care what video games they're playing, but when they're at the firehouse, they're required to respond to calls. So they're doing something they want to do. They'd be sitting in their basement anyway playing video games, but now they're at the firehouse, and when the tones go off, they're there to respond to calls. So you're increasing that engagement and showing these people that, hey, you might belong in this scenario. We can work with you and make you feel comfortable in this environment. And hey, they may even get some virtual training done while they're there. Right, so huge potential impact for enhanced recruitment, improved retention, and stronger culture. So absolutely there's a lot of room for use of immersive learning in the fire service. I don't think it likes me anymore.
Uh-oh. Hang on. Okay.
Do you just want to hit the next arrow? Oh, that doesn't work either.
No, it's, I know what to do.
We're all stuck in the world of immersive learning. Literally, you start talking about technology and then it stops working. Oh.
If it's immersive, I can help. Try it now. Try the advanced now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there it goes. All right, so that was everything. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you guys about Science to the Station. So Dr. Jenke had an amazing idea and treated this organization like it was a child. It was a whole thing about what are we going to name the organization. And so Science to the Station, a health and wellness alliance, Science to the Station for short, is our like translation and dissemination arm of our research group. If you scan this QR code, it should take you to the Science to the Station page. You can put in your information. Science to the Station in the next year or so will be a membership-driven organization, meaning you will pay for certain parts of the website and access to different things, which will be amazing. But if you scan this QR code and put in the code NAFTY 2025, you'll get 1 year free membership access to the organization, which is very exciting. So I'll give you a minute to scan that code. I also want to tell you that we have a conference upcoming. Oh, you need it still? We have a conference upcoming in Loveland, Colorado, November 3rd through 5th. We are very excited. It is all things firefighter health and wellness. We really want to bring the research to the firefighter, science to the station, science to the street. We want to make it applicable and relevant. We limit scientific presentations to 12 minutes. We call them Fred Talks, Firefighter Research, Education, and Design. So it's kind of like a TED Talk, right? And you know that TED gives their speakers very, very specific instructions. You have to have your speech memorized. You can't be reading from notes. You can't be reading from your slides. You have a limited number of slides, and you really have to present the information that's engaging to the audience. That's what this is about. And then in the afternoon, we have Bringing It to Practice, where we have a practitioner or a researcher alongside a firefighter, so they can kind of work in tandem to tell you the importance of research and how it's impactful for the fire service. The Science to the Station conferences are amazing. Registration is now open. The hotel is incredibly full. I think we might be in our overflow hotel, but you are welcome. Registration is still open November 3rd through 5th in Colorado. And then this is my email address if you guys have any questions for me. I think I'm getting close to time, but I'm happy to take any questions or any discussion. Thank you. I know that was a lot of information.
Sorry, so
No, please.
just a question,
Yes?
and this takes me back to a statement that a previous fire chief told me one time, and he said, if you want to deal with recruitment and retention in the fire service, we need more structure fires. And then he explained it, and it made sense to me.
Yeah.
But is there, and maybe you don't have an answer for this yet, but is there a relationship between the training you're doing and actually going out and doing it? Because we're training for a structure fire, great, you can train for training, but you don't get any of them, or very few, and you're going to medical calls, right? So I think
Excellent
there's
question.
that piece, right? Are we training, and then, like you said earlier, doing the job as a firefighter, and if we're having that big gap, that's also painful, I think, for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, excellent question. So the question was, if the job is so little structure fires and so much all the other, like all hazards, how are we dealing with that in bringing personnel in? And I think delicately, because I think the fire service is the one who does not want to admit that we are more of an all hazards service rather than like specifically a fire service. So delicately, but you make a good point, and it did come up, especially in interviews, and people talked about, I mentioned earlier, like the differentiation of roles and not requiring folks to have fire 1 and 2. So there were a lot of departments that I talked to. They were like, oh yeah, so I'd ask them, okay, what are training requirements when folks first come into your department? And it was, oh yeah, as soon as they come in the door, we gotta get them fire 1 and 2, and they gotta get gear, and they like very fire focused. And then there are other departments that I talked to that were like, oh yeah, when they come in the door, I ask them what they're interested in. And that's another thing, is promoting your fire service as more than just fighting fire, because you want to get folks that are interested in more things, because you're not often running the fire calls, right? So if you're in a wildland area, you need people that are interested in wildland firefighting. You need people that are interested in EMS. You need people that are interested in swift water rescue, or all the things, right? And so that's a wonderful point, and it did come up. And I think that's part of that kind of modularization of training. And I also think that may be something that if you sit on like NFPA committees, right, having those discussions, or like your state training requirements as well. So a lot of states require, if the person is a member of the volunteer fire department, they have to have a certain level of certification. So I think perhaps that needs to change. And maybe it's the same if you're going interior, but right, how often are they going interior? So do we really need these certifications? And I think that's a huge question, and a great question for NAFTE. And what do we look at as training standards? And perhaps we move not away from fire training specifically, but we enhance that curriculum to be more inclusive of the jobs we're actually doing. And that also speaks to training requirements. Communities mentioned like roadway incidents. Some communities, rural communities, have a large highway going through, so they absolutely have to work on roadway incidents, extrication, vehicle fires, lithium-ion batteries, whereas folks that don't have a major roadway going through their district, they don't need that same training. Or high-rise buildings, right? If there are no buildings above 2 stories in your jurisdiction, you probably don't need standpipe training and learning like going up 5 floors and fighting the fire from the fire below. Right. So yes, I think absolutely we need to have a discussion about modularized training and how to, I don't want to like pick and choose, but kind of an a la carte menu, right? Not for the firefighter, but for the chief of the department to identify like what calls are responsive in my response district and what works for my organization. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a conversation we need to have. What else? All right. Thank you guys very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.